The morning of January 14th, 1887, dawned with a stillness that pressed against the lungs like a weight. The thermometer nailed to the post outside Hadley's General Store read 32 degrees below zero, though old Samuel Hadley would later swear the mercury had simply given up and retreated into the bulb like a frightened animal. Jasper Creek, Colorado Territory, population 163 souls, lay beneath a sky the color of hammered tin, and the smoke that rose from its chimneys climbed straight upward in thin, desperate threads before being swallowed by the cold. Some chimneys produced no smoke at all. Beatrice Beckett stood at the entrance of her cliff dwelling, a woolen shawl wrapped twice around her shoulders, and counted the silent rooftops. 14 homes with no smoke, which meant 14 families had either run out of fuel or run out of the strength to tend their fires. Either possibility ended the same way in weather like this. The killing winter had entered its 7th week with no sign of relenting. She had known it would come. Not this specific winter, perhaps, but one like it, eventually, inevitably. The mountains had been speaking since October, and Beatrice had listened the way her grandmother had taught her to listen, with patience and humility, and none of the arrogance that made men believe they could predict nothing and therefore need prepare for nothing. Inside her chambers, carved into the living rock of the cliff face, 400 glass jars caught the weak light filtering through the double-walled front, preserved vegetables in neat rows, organized by type and date, their contents suspended in brine or vinegar or their own rendered juices. In the smokehouse chamber beyond, 200 pounds of cured meat hung from hooks driven into the stone ceiling. Strings of dried apples festooned the walls like amber curtains, filling the air with a faint sweetness that seemed almost defiant against the death that prowled the valley below. Beatrice turned back inside and closed the heavy timber door behind her. The warmth enveloped her immediately, held close by 3 feet of solid sandstone on 3 sides, and the sawdust-insulated front wall that had cost her $47 in lumber alone. The wood-burning stove ticked and popped, venting through natural fissures in the rock that drew the smoke upward and away without betraying her position to the cold. She had built this. She had built this with her own hands and her grandmother's wisdom, and $237 that represented every cent of her widow's portion, and 3 years of washing other people's laundry. And now, while the town below slowly starved and froze, she was warm and fed and possessed of enough provisions to last until spring and beyond. The town had laughed at her. Let them. If you're watching this and you've ever felt dismissed for doing things differently, drop a comment below. And if you want to see what happens when conventional wisdom meets unconventional survival, make sure you're subscribed. Beatrice remembered the day she had arrived in Jasper Creek as clearly as she remembered her grandmother's hands, spotted with age and strong as cedar roots, showing her how to pack salt around a ham. It had been the spring of 1884, the aspens just beginning to bud along the creek, and she had ridden into town on a sorrel mare named Constance, who was the only living thing that had not looked at her with pity when she had left Tennessee. She had been 24 years old and a widow for 9 months. Her husband, William Beckett, had been a good man who died badly, fever taking him in 3 days of delirium and suffering that no amount of love or prayer could ease. They had been married for 3 months. She had known him for 6. Her mother-in-law had made clear, through silences and sighs and a single devastating sentence spoken over William's grave, that Beatrice's presence was no longer required or desired in the Beckett household. So she had taken her widow's portion, her grandmother's knowledge, and her horse, and she had ridden west until she found a place that reminded her of home without being home, where the mountains rose like the Tennessee bluffs she had known as a child, and where no one knew her name or her story or had any expectations of what she should do with her grief. Her grandmother Eliza had died the winter Beatrice turned 16. 8 years gone now, but Beatrice could still hear her voice, could still feel the gentle correction of those strong hands guiding her own as she learned to can tomatoes, to smoke venison, to read the signs that the mountains gave to those patient enough to observe them. "The mountains will tell you what's coming, child," Eliza had said, her breath rattling in her chest as the consumption that would kill her within the month tightened its grip. "You just have to listen." She had died in her bed, surrounded by the jars she had filled and the knowledge she had passed down through 5 generations of mountain women. Beatrice's mother had been there, and her aunts, and all of them had wept. But only Beatrice had truly understood what had been lost. Her mother could preserve food, yes, but she did it by rote, following steps without understanding principles. Her aunts could read some signs, but they relied on almanacs and neighbors' opinions more than their own observations. Only Beatrice had learned to listen. And so when she rode into Jasper Creek and saw the sandstone cliff face on the eastern edge of town, rising golden and solid above a patch of scrubland that no one wanted, she had known immediately what she would do. The land had cost her $12, and the man who sold it to her had looked at her with the particular mixture of pity and condescension that she would come to know well in her first months in Jasper Creek. "It is barren, ma'am," he had said, as if she could not see this for herself. "Cannot plow it, cannot graze it. The cliff face makes it shadowy half the day. I cannot in good conscience. I will take it," Beatrice had said, and she had counted out the coins while he watched with an expression that suggested he was witnessing either a miracle or a tragedy, and could not determine which. She had led Constance up the rocky path that would become her road, had stood before the cliff face with its natural indentations and its seeping spring and its southern exposure that the land agent had failed to notice, and she had begun to plan. Those first months had been filled with labor that left her muscles aching and her hands blistered and her heart, for the first time since William's death, too tired for grief. She had hired a mason from Denver for $63 to help her understand the principles of carving sandstone, and then she had done the work herself, chipping away at the cliff face with hammer and chisel while the town below watched and whispered. The project took 14 months. She carved 3 interconnected chambers, each one deeper into the cliff than the last. The outermost served as her living space, with a hearth built against the stone and a bed tucked into an alcove where the rock curved naturally to shelter it. The middle chamber became her larder, with floor-to-ceiling shelves that she built herself from timber hauled up the cliff path on Constance's patient back. The innermost chamber, the coolest and darkest, held the natural spring that had first drawn her eye to this particular spot, its water cold and clean and constant regardless of the season. The front wall cost her $47 in lumber and another $18 in sawdust for insulation. She built it double thick, with a gap between the layers that she packed tight against the cold. The door was solid oak, 4 inches thick, with iron hinges that had been salvaged from a collapsed barn 20 miles south. The stove cost $31, plus $7 for the piping that she modified to vent through the natural fissures in the rock ceiling. She had studied those fissures for weeks before making her purchase, burning small fires and watching where the smoke went, ensuring that her home would not fill with fumes during the long months when opening a window meant inviting death inside. The glass jars came from various sources over the course of a year. Some she bought new from Hadley's General Store, 50 cents each for the quart size. Others she acquired from families who no longer needed them, widows clearing out their husbands' effects or homesteaders giving up and heading back east. By the time the first snow fell in 1885, she had accumulated 412 jars, stacked empty on her shelves like promises waiting to be kept. She filled them that first summer with methodical precision. Tomatoes and beans and corn from her small garden. Wild berries gathered from the slopes above town. Venison traded for laundry services, which she cut into strips and smoked in the chamber she had carved specifically for that purpose. The smoke drifted up through a natural chimney in the rock, dispersing so completely that no one below could trace its source. By the autumn of 1886, 2 full years after her arrival, her stores were complete. 400 jars of preserved vegetables, 200 pounds of smoked and salted meat, strings of dried apples that she had purchased from an orchard 3 valleys over, slicing and threading and hanging them in the dry air of her middle chamber until they turned the color of old gold. If you want to see exactly how to build something that lasts, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's more coming that you're not going to want to miss. The town had taken notice by then, though not in the manner she might have wished. Zane Greystone, the schoolmaster, was the first to give voice to what others merely thought. He was a man of 43 years, with a library of 200 books that he referenced frequently in conversation, and a certainty about the world that Beatrice recognized as the particular arrogance of educated men who had never had occasion to be proven wrong. It happened at a town meeting in September of 1885, when Beatrice had attended to hear discussion of the new well that was being proposed for the Eastern District. She sat in the back, as was her habit, but Greystone's voice carried clearly to every corner of the schoolhouse. "I see Mr. Beckett's widow has joined us," he announced, though she had not spoken or drawn attention to herself in any way. "Perhaps she can advise us on the construction. She fancies herself a cliff swallow, building her mud nest while civilized people build proper homes. Perhaps she learned architecture from the same place she learned economy, the animal kingdom." The laughter that followed was not universal, but it was enough. Beatrice felt the heat rise in her cheeks, felt the old familiar urge to defend herself, to explain, to justify her choices to people who had already decided what she was. She said nothing. After the meeting, she walked home in the gathering dark with Constance's warm breath on her shoulder, and she allowed herself the luxury of speaking aloud only when she was certain no one could hear. "They do not know," she told the mayor, stroking her sorrel neck. "They cannot know. They have never had occasion to learn what the mountains can teach, and so they believe there is nothing to learn. But the winter will come, Constance, the real winter, and when it does, we will be ready." The mayor's only response was a soft exhale that misted in the cooling air. Eleanor Greystone's campaign began within the week. It was subtle at first, as such things often are among women who have been taught that cruelty must wear the mask of civility. Beatrice learned of it not through direct confrontation, but through absence, through the invitations that stopped arriving and the conversations that fell silent when she approached the counter at Hadley's General Store. The Ladies' Auxiliary of Jasper Creek had been organizing the Autumn Harvest Social, an event that brought together every woman in the territory for 3 days of quilting, preserving, and the particular form of fellowship that allowed neighbors to become something like family. Beatrice had attended the previous year, had sat quietly at the edge of the quilting circle and contributed her stitches without comment, had been tolerated, if not welcomed. This year, she learned of the social only when it was already underway. She had walked into town for supplies, salt and lamp oil, and a new whetstone for her knives, and had found the general store nearly empty. Samuel Hadley stood behind his counter with an expression that she had learned to recognize, the particular discomfort of a decent man caught between his conscience and his community. "The ladies are all at the social, Mrs. Beckett," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Over at the Greystone place. 3 days of it this year. Mrs. Greystone organized the whole affair." Beatrice set her purchases on the counter and counted out her coins. "I was not aware." "No," Hadley said quietly. "I do not imagine you were." She did not ask why she'd been excluded. She did not need to ask. The answer was written in Hadley's averted gaze, in the way his wife had stopped nodding to her on the street, in the careful distance that had grown between herself and every other woman in Jasper Creek. The swallow's nest. That was what they called her home now, and by extension, what they called her. Greystone had coined the phrase at the town meeting, but it was his wife who had given it wings, repeating it in parlors and at quilting frames and over tea until the name had become a fixture of local speech. "Have you heard about the swallow's nest?" women would ask each other, and the answer was always a variation on the same theme: that the widow Beckett had lost her mind along with her husband, that she was hoarding food like a miser hoards gold, that she had carved herself a cave like an animal because she lacked the refinement to live among civilized people. Beatrice heard the whispers, she saw the pointed glances, and she continued her work. The winter of 1885 to 1886 was mild, and this fact seemed to confirm everything the town believed about her. The snow came late and melted early. The temperatures rarely dropped below zero. Families who had stored only minimal provisions made it through without hardship, and those who had mocked Beatrice's preparations felt themselves vindicated. "The cliff swallow hoarded her acorns," Greystone announced at the spring thaw celebration, his voice carrying across the crowded schoolhouse, and the squirrels had more sense than she did. They knew a gentle winter when they saw one coming. The laughter was louder this time, more confident. Even those who had remained neutral in the autumn now joined in the general merriment at her expense. Beatrice stood near the door, a cup of cider growing warm in her hand, and watched the faces of her neighbors twist with amusement at her folly. She set the cider down untasted and walked home in the twilight. That night, alone in her chambers with only the sound of the spring trickling in the innermost room, she spoke to the darkness the words she would not speak to another living soul. "They do not understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "One mild winter, and they believe all winters will be mild. One year of plenty, and they forget that famine ever existed. My grandmother survived winters that killed educated men, and I will not abandon her wisdom because fools laugh at it. If you've ever been mocked for being prepared when nothing went wrong, you understand exactly what Beatrice was feeling. Drop your story in the comments and make sure you're subscribed for what comes next." The summer of 1886 brought new rumors and fresh exclusions. Beatrice attended church services, sitting in the back pew where she could observe without being observed, and noted the way conversations paused when she approached and resumed when she passed. She went to Hadley's general store for supplies and overheard fragments of whispered assessments. "Touched in the head," one woman murmured to another, not quite softly enough. "Living in that cave like a hermit. Her poor husband must have seen what was coming and died to escape it." Beatrice purchased her salt and her sugar and her jars, 50 cents each for the quart size, and carried them home without reply. But in the privacy of her cliff dwelling, with Constance grazing on the small patch of grass that grew near the spring's overflow, she allowed herself to feel the weight of their scorn. "They think I am mad," she told the mare, running her hand along the warm, sorrel neck. "They think my grandmother's wisdom is superstition, and my preparations are hoarding. Let them think what they will. The mountains do not care for the opinions of schoolmasters, and neither shall I." Constance turned her head and regarded Beatrice with one large dark eye. "My grandmother survived winters that killed educated men," Beatrice said, repeating the words that had become her private litany. "I will follow her wisdom, and let the seasons prove who was foolish." October came, and with it, signs that only Beatrice seemed to notice. The woolly caterpillars that year were solid black from end to end without the brown bands that usually marked their segments. This was a sign her grandmother had taught her to read, one of a dozen indicators that the old women of Tennessee had observed across generations of lean winters and hard years. Solid black caterpillars meant cold that would cut to the bone. The squirrels were burying their nuts twice as deep as usual, scratching at the frozen ground with a desperation that seemed almost frantic. Beatrice watched them from her cliff dwelling, noting the way they worked without pause from dawn to dusk, as if some instinct told them that their survival depended on provisions that their conscious minds could not calculate. The geese flew south 6 weeks early. She counted the formations as they passed overhead, the great V's heading toward warmer country with an urgency she had never seen before. In most years, the geese lingered until late November, fattening themselves on the last of the autumn grain. This year, they were gone before the leaves had finished turning. She shared these observations at the general store on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, speaking to Samuel Hadley while she selected dried beans from the barrel near the door. "The caterpillars are solid black this year, Mr. Hadley," she said, "and the geese have already gone. In Tennessee, these would be signs of a killing winter." Hadley had listened with the careful attention of a man who respected knowledge even when he did not fully understand it. He had opened his mouth to reply when Zane Greystone's voice cut across the store like a blade. "Superstition is the refuge of the uneducated mind, Mrs. Beckett." The schoolmaster stood near the window, a newspaper folded beneath his arm, and a smile on his face that did not reach his eyes. He had clearly been browsing the periodicals, but had interrupted his reading to deliver his pronouncement with the full weight of his authority. "The Farmer's Almanac predicts a mild winter," he continued, addressing the store at large rather than Beatrice directly. "Scientific observation trumps folk tales. But I suppose those of us who can read must make allowances for those who cannot." Beatrice met his gaze without flinching. "I can read, Mr. Greystone. I simply choose to read the mountains rather than the almanac." "Ah." His smile widened, showing teeth. "And what do the mountains tell you, Mrs. Beckett? Do they speak in words, or do they communicate through signs and portents, like the oracles of ancient Greece?" "They speak through caterpillars and geese," she said steadily, "through the depth of squirrel burrows and the thickness of beaver dams. They speak through the angle of the light and the smell of the wind, and 1,000 small details that almanacs cannot print, because no one has thought to observe them." "Fascinating." Greystone turned to address the other customers, 3 women who had stopped their shopping to watch the exchange. "Ladies, you have heard it from the cliff swallow herself. She reads caterpillars. Perhaps we should consult the insects before making any important decisions. I'm sure the beetles have opinions about the new church roof, and the moths may wish to weigh in on the school curriculum." The laughter was sharp and immediate. Beatrice felt it wash over her like cold water, but she did not look away from Greystone's face. "My grandmother survived winters that killed educated men," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I will follow her wisdom and let the seasons prove who was foolish." She paid for her beans and walked out of the store without another word. That night, the first hard frost came early, 3 weeks before the usual date. Beatrice stood at the entrance of her cliff dwelling and watched the stars burn cold and distant above the mountains, and she knew with the certainty of inherited wisdom that this winter would be different. The beaver dams along Jasper Creek were built high that year, higher than any of the old-timers could remember. The beavers had constructed their lodges with walls twice the usual thickness, layering mud and sticks with what seemed like desperation. When Beatrice mentioned this to Hadley during her next visit to the store, he had nodded slowly. "My father used to say the same," he admitted, keeping his voice low, "about the beavers. Said they knew things men could only guess at." "Then perhaps you should prepare," Beatrice said. "Lay in stores. Stack wood higher than you think necessary. Buy lamp oil while it remains available." Hadley had looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Then he had glanced toward the window, where Greystone could be seen crossing the street toward the schoolhouse. "I will consider your words, Mrs. Beckett," he said finally. And then even more quietly, "Though I would ask that you not mention this conversation to others. My wife, she and Mrs. Greystone are particular friends." Beatrice understood. She paid for her purchases and left without speaking to anyone else. But over the following weeks, she noticed that the Hadley woodpile grew taller and that Samuel began stocking additional supplies in the back room of his store. He did not acknowledge her advice openly, but he followed it, and that was enough. November arrived with a false spring that deceived everyone except Beatrice. The temperatures rose for 3 days, climbing to nearly 50 degrees, and the snow that had fallen in late October began to melt. Women emerged from their homes to walk the streets without heavy coats. Children played in the mud. Greystone declared from the schoolhouse steps that the winter would be mild after all, that the scientific predictions had been correct, that superstition had once again proven inferior to education. Beatrice watched the warm winds and felt the lie beneath them. "It is a trap," she told Constance that evening, standing with the mare at the entrance to her cliff dwelling while the last light faded from the sky. "The cold is gathering itself. The mountains are holding their breath. When the winter comes, it will come hard, and it will not relent." The mare's ears swiveled toward her voice, attentive as always to her tone if not her words. "They will not believe me if I speak again," Beatrice continued, stroking the sorrel neck. "They have already decided what I am. A mad woman, a cliff swallow, a creature to be pitied and mocked and excluded from polite society." She paused, watching the last threads of sunset fade to darkness. "But I will be here when the cold comes, and when they need me, I will remember my grandmother's words. She did not help people because they deserved help. She helped them because help was needed. That is what survival means, Constance. Not outlasting others, but ensuring that others also last." Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this story is about to take a turn that changes everything. On November 28, 1886, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. The false spring vanished as if it had never existed, replaced by a cold so profound that the air itself seemed to solidify. Water froze in buckets before it could be carried indoors. Horses refused to leave their stables. The smoke from chimneys rose straight upward and then stopped, hanging in the air like frozen ghosts. The killing winter had begun. Beatrice stood at the entrance of her cliff dwelling and watched the town below disappear beneath a curtain of snow that fell without cease for 3 days. The wind howled through the valley like a living thing, a predator stalking the weak and the unprepared. The thermometer at Hadley's store, which would later be recovered from the rubble of the collapsed porch, recorded temperatures of 26 degrees below zero on the first night. It would get colder. Inside her chambers, Beatrice tended her fire and checked her stores and listened to the wind scream against the stone walls that had been laughed at, mocked, dismissed as the folly of an uneducated mind. The jars gleamed in the firelight, 400 glass containers holding vegetables and fruits that would not freeze because the stone held the earth's warmth. The smoked meat hung in the middle chamber, protected from the elements by 3 feet of sandstone and the wisdom of 5 generations of mountain women. The cold could not touch her here. But outside, beyond the reach of her preparations, the people who had mocked her were beginning to understand what the mountains had been trying to tell them all along. The cold that descended upon Jasper Creek in those first days of December was not merely weather. It was judgment rendered in ice and wind, a sentence passed upon the unprepared with the same implacable certainty that governs all natural law. The thermometer at Hadley's store, before the porch collapsed and buried it beneath snow and shattered timber, recorded a temperature of 31 degrees below zero on the morning of December 3rd. By December 7th, the mercury had retreated so far into the glass that Samuel Hadley stopped checking altogether. There was no point in measuring what had become immeasurable. The snow continued to fall in sheets so thick that a person standing at one end of Main Street could not see the other. The wind drove the flakes horizontally, packing them against doors and windows with the patient malice of a predator burying its prey. Drifts rose to the eaves of single-story buildings within the first week. By the second week, some homes had become tombs of white, their inhabitants trapped inside with dwindling supplies and failing fires. Beatrice watched from the entrance of her cliff dwelling as the world below transformed into something unrecognizable. The town that had excluded her from its quilting circles and harvest socials was disappearing, building by building, beneath a shroud of frozen white. The smoke that rose from chimneys grew thinner each day, fainter, and in some cases ceased altogether. She counted the silent chimneys each morning, a grim census of failure and desperation. 14 on the first day of January, 17 by the 5th, 22 by the 10th. The cold was a hunter, and it was patient. Inside her chambers, Beatrice moved through her daily rituals with the calm efficiency her grandmother had taught her. She fed the fire carefully, never allowing it to burn too hot and waste fuel, never letting it sink too low and lose its battle against the stone's chill. She checked her stores methodically, counting jars and calculating weeks, ensuring that her preparations would outlast even the most brutal winter the mountains could send. The spring in her innermost chamber continued to flow, unfrozen, protected by the earth's own warmth that radiated through the stone. She had water when others were melting snow in pots that soon ran dry of fuel to heat them. The contrast between her circumstances and those of the town below was not something she took pleasure in. There was no satisfaction in watching people suffer, even people who had mocked her, excluded her, whispered that her husband had died to escape her strange ways. But there was a grim validation in it, a confirmation of everything her grandmother had taught her about the wisdom of preparation and the folly of pride. The mountains had spoken. She had listened. They had not. The Hendricks house stood on the corner of Main Street and the road that led to the creek, a fine two-story frame structure that Marcus Hendricks had built the summer before his marriage. It had cost him $1,100, not counting the furniture shipped from Denver, and he had boasted at the saloon that it was the finest home between Jasper Creek and the territorial capital. The walls were single-board construction with decorative trim. The windows were large and numerous, designed to let in light rather than keep out cold. The roof was pitched at an angle that shed rain beautifully but collected snow like a basin. On the morning of December 14th, the weight of accumulated snow proved greater than the engineering of the roof could bear. The collapse happened just after dawn, while the family slept in the upstairs bedrooms where they had retreated to conserve heat. The sound, according to those who heard it from neighboring houses, was like thunder trapped underground, a deep groaning followed by a crack that echoed across the frozen valley. Marcus Hendricks and his wife Sarah escaped through a window, crawling across the snow in their nightclothes, their bare feet turning black with frostbite before they reached the shelter of the Miller home next door. Their daughter Elizabeth, 16 years old and quick-thinking, threw herself beneath the heavy oak dresser that had belonged to her grandmother, and the falling timbers glanced off its solid frame instead of crushing her. But Thomas Hendricks, 8 years old, had been reading by the fire in the parlor below. He had crept downstairs in the early hours, unable to sleep, seeking the warmth of the dying embers and the comfort of his favorite book of adventure stories. When the roof came down, it brought the second floor with it, and the parlor became a grave of timber and snow and shattered dreams. They did not find his body until spring. The news spread through the town like the cold itself, penetrating every home, every heart. A child had died. Not from fever or accident, but from the winter that Beatrice Beckett had warned them was coming. The winter that Zane Greystone had dismissed as superstition. The winter that the Farmer's Almanac had promised would be mild. If you want to see exactly how a community reckons with that kind of loss, and what happens when they finally turn to the woman they mocked, make sure you are subscribed and hit that notification bell now. Old Widow Patterson was found on the 19th of December, frozen in her bed with her Bible clutched to her chest and her coal bucket empty beside the stove. She had been dead for at least 2 days before anyone thought to check on her. Her nearest neighbor, the Simmons family, had been struggling with their own survival and had assumed the widow was managing as she always had. Tough and independent and unwilling to ask for help. She was 73 years old, and she had survived the journey west in a covered wagon, the death of her husband to a mining accident, the birth of 6 children and the burial of 4. She had endured droughts and floods and locust swarms and the 1,000 small catastrophes that made up life on the frontier. But she could not endure a winter without coal, and a community too consumed with its own suffering to remember that the elderly and the alone needed checking on. Beatrice learned of the widow's death from the smoke signals of the town's grief, the particular quality of movement she observed through her spyglass as people gathered around the Patterson cabin with bowed heads and helpless hands. She had not known the widow well, had only exchanged nods with her at the general store, but she remembered her grandmother's words about the obligations of survival. You do not help people because they deserve help. You help them because help is needed. But how could she help those who would not accept help from her? How could she save people who had decided she was mad, uneducated, a creature to be mocked rather than heeded? The question haunted her as the days grew shorter, and the cold grew deeper, and the chimneys of Jasper Creek continued to fall silent, one by one, like candles snuffed by an invisible hand. The infant daughter of the Morales family died on the 3rd of January, 1887. Her name was Isabella, and she had been born in September, a healthy child with her mother's dark eyes and her father's strong grip. She had survived her first autumn, her first snowfall, her first Christmas, which her parents had celebrated with a small wooden cross and prayers for a spring that seemed impossibly distant. But there was no milk to be had in Jasper Creek that January. The dairy cows had frozen in their barns or been slaughtered for meat that ran out too quickly. The goats had died. The canned milk at Hadley's store had been sold weeks ago, and there was no more coming until the roads cleared, which would not happen for months. Maria Morales tried to feed her daughter on broth, on water mixed with flour, on anything that might sustain a body too small to sustain itself. Isabella died in her mother's arms on a night when the temperature dropped to 34 degrees below zero. She simply stopped breathing, her tiny heart giving out after weeks of inadequate nutrition, her body too weak to fight the cold that crept through the cracks in the adobe walls of the Morales home. Her father, Diego, wrapped her in the blanket his own mother had woven before the journey north, and he carried her to the frozen ground behind the church where he could not dig a grave because the earth was harder than stone. She would wait there, wrapped in wool and love and grief, until the spring thaw made burial possible. Beatrice heard Maria's keening from the cliff dwelling, the sound carrying across the frozen valley like the cry of a wounded animal. It was a sound that transcended language and culture and the petty divisions that had kept the town from accepting the Tennessee widow and her strange ways. It was the sound of a mother losing her child, and it echoed against the stone walls of the chamber where Beatrice sat surrounded by jars of preserved vegetables and strings of dried apples and more food than any family in Jasper Creek would see for months. She could not give the infant back her life, but she could ensure that no other children died of hunger while she sat in abundance. The question was whether anyone would accept help from the cliff swallow, the mad woman, the widow whose husband had died to escape her. Zane Greystone's schoolhouse collapsed on the morning of January 9th. The building had been his pride, constructed 5 years earlier with funds he had personally raised from the territorial government and the families of Jasper Creek. It had held 200 books, his personal library, volumes of Shakespeare and Milton, and scientific texts that represented everything he believed about the superiority of education over superstition. The books had been shipped from Boston at considerable expense, and he had spent countless hours cataloging them, caring for them, dreaming of the civilized minds they would create in this frontier wilderness. The roof gave way under the weight of accumulated snow and ice, and the walls followed, and the books were buried beneath a tomb of frozen timber and shattered glass. When the spring finally came, the salvage crews would find the volumes frozen together in blocks, their pages fused by ice and meltwater, their words rendered illegible by the winter that Greystone had insisted would be mild. The schoolmaster stood in the wreckage of his life's work and wept. His wife, Eleanor, who had organized the Ladies' Auxiliary to exclude Beatrice from all social functions, stood beside him with her hand on his arm, and her face as gray as the frozen sky. Their home still stood, though barely. Their children still lived, though they were hungry and cold and frightened. But the schoolhouse was gone, and with it the proof of everything Greystone had believed about the power of education to overcome the primitive warnings of uneducated women who listened to caterpillars and geese. He did not think of Beatrice Beckett as he stood in the ruins. He could not afford to think of her, because thinking of her meant acknowledging that she had been right and he had been wrong, and that acknowledgment was more than his pride could bear. Not yet. Not while he still had pride left to protect. By the 14th of January, the town of Jasper Creek had lost 3 souls to the cold, and many more to despair. The granary was nearly empty. The general store had been stripped of everything edible, and Samuel Hadley was rationing what remained to families with children, turning away single men and elderly women who had no one to advocate for them. The prices had risen to levels that would have been called gouging in any other circumstance. But Hadley was not a greedy man. He was simply a desperate one, trying to stretch insufficient supplies across too many mouths. The smoke rose from fewer chimneys each morning, 26 silent by the 14th, 30 by the 20th. The town was dying, building by building, family by family, and there seemed to be nothing anyone could do to stop it. Except for the woman in the cliff dwelling on the eastern edge of town. The woman with 400 jars of preserved food and 200 pounds of smoked meat and a spring that never froze. The woman who had warned them, who had been mocked for her warning, who had retreated to her stone chambers and waited for the winter to prove which of them had been the fool. The question was who would be the first to go to her. Who would swallow their pride and climb the path to the cliff dwelling and admit that the cliff swallow had been wiser than them all? Eleanor Greystone made the journey on the morning of January 17, 1887. She did not go for herself. She did not go for her husband, whose pride remained intact, even as his library lay frozen beneath the ruins of his schoolhouse. She went for the children. 6 of Zane's students were orphans now, their parents dead or vanished or incapacitated by cold and hunger. They had been sleeping in the Methodist church, which had become a makeshift shelter for those whose homes had failed. But the church was running out of fuel and food and hope. The children were growing thin, their eyes too large for their faces, their ribs visible beneath their ragged clothes. Eleanor could not watch them die, not while there was a woman on the cliff with food to spare. The path to the dwelling was treacherous, covered in ice and snow, and Eleanor fell twice before she reached the entrance. Her hands were bleeding by the time she pulled herself up the final slope, and her face was raw from the wind that never seemed to stop blowing. But she made it, and she stood at the doorway of the cliff dwelling, and she waited. Beatrice emerged from the warmth within, wrapped in a wool shawl her grandmother had made, her face calm and unsurprised. She looked at Eleanor Greystone, the woman who had organized her exclusion from polite society, and she said nothing. She simply waited. "I've come to ask for your help," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled from cold and something else that might have been shame. "Not for myself, for the children. 6 of them, orphans, sleeping in the church. They are dying, Mrs. Beckett. They are dying, and I cannot save them, and I do not know where else to turn." Beatrice studied the woman who had spread the nickname Swallow's Nest through the Ladies' Auxiliary, who had ensured that Beatrice was never invited to quilting circles or harvest socials or any of the gatherings that made up the social fabric of frontier life. She saw the pride that had been stripped away by desperation, the shame that burned beneath the surface, the genuine fear for children who were not her own, but who had become her responsibility nonetheless. And she remembered her grandmother's words. You do not help people because they deserve help. You help them because help is needed. Bring them, Beatrice said. Bring the children, and any families who need food. 3 at a time, so we do not overwhelm the chambers. I will feed them, and I will teach them what I know, so that this never happens again. Eleanor's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked as if she might weep. But frontier women did not weep easily, and she controlled herself with visible effort. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Mrs. Beckett. I do not deserve your kindness." "No," Beatrice agreed quietly, "but the children do. And that is what matters now." She stepped aside and gestured toward the warmth within, and Eleanor Greystone, who had mocked the cliff swallow and her mud nest, entered the dwelling that would save her community from the winter that had come to destroy it. The first families arrived within hours of Eleanor's departure. They came in groups of 3, as Beatrice had instructed, climbing the treacherous path with children bundled against their chests and shame written across their wind-burned faces. Beatrice met each group at the entrance, wordless and efficient, guiding them into the warmth of her outer chamber where the stove radiated heat and the strings of dried apples swayed gently in the currents of warm air. She fed them first, always first. Soup made from preserved vegetables and smoked venison, thick and rich and steaming in the ceramic bowls she had brought from Tennessee. The children ate with the desperate focus of the starving, their spoons scraping against the bowls, their eyes never leaving the pot that held more. The adults ate more slowly, as if they could not quite believe that food still existed in such abundance, as if they expected at any moment for the dream to end and the hunger to return. Only after they had eaten did Beatrice begin to teach. She showed them the shelves of glass jars, 400 strong, each one labeled with its contents and the date of preservation. She explained the principles of canning, the importance of sterilization, the way that salt and vinegar and heat combine to hold decay at bay. She showed them the smokehouse chamber, where the cured meat hung from hooks driven into the living stone, and she described the process of smoking, the types of wood that worked best, the temperature and duration that meant the difference between preservation and rot. She showed them the spring in the innermost chamber, its water cold and clean and constant, and she explained how she had studied the fissures in the rock to ensure ventilation, how she had built the double walls to hold the warmth, how she had chosen this location precisely because the cliff face provided what no frame house ever could: 3 walls of solid stone that no winter could penetrate. If you are learning something from Beatrice's story right now, hit that subscribe button. What comes next? Change this town forever. The children listened with the attention of the young, absorbing knowledge the way dry earth absorbs rain. The adults listened with something else in their eyes, something that looked like regret and revelation combined. Many of them had stood in the crowd at that town meeting 18 months earlier, when Zane Greystone had called her a cliff swallow building a mud nest. Many of them had laughed. None of them laughed now. By the end of January, Beatrice had fed 47 people. By mid-February, that number had risen to 83. Her stores diminished steadily, but they had been built to endure, and she rationed with the same methodical precision that had guided their accumulation. Families came in shifts, 3 at a time, staying long enough to eat and learn and warm themselves before making way for the next group. The path to her dwelling became packed and navigable, worn smooth by the passage of desperate feet. Samuel Hadley came on the 3rd of February, not to receive, but to offer what little remained in his store. He climbed the path with the sack of flour over his shoulder and apologies on his lips. "I should have listened," he said, standing at her threshold with snow in his graying beard. "When you told me about the caterpillars and the geese, I should have listened instead of nodding and doing nothing." "You did listen," Beatrice said quietly. "You simply did not act. There is a difference, and it matters less than you think. The flower is welcome. The next family will be grateful." She took the sack from his hands, and something in his face eased, as if a burden had been partially lifted from his shoulders. The deaths continued, but more slowly now. An elderly man named Josiah Crane passed in his sleep on the 8th of February, his body discovered by the neighbor who had been bringing him food from Beatrice's stores. A young mother named Catherine Wells died giving birth to a son who lived only hours longer than she did. The Methodist Church served as both shelter and morgue, the living and the dead separated by nothing more than a hung blanket and the knowledge that the distance between them grew shorter with each passing day. But the children survived. All 6 of the orphans that Eleanor had spoken of survived, fed by Beatrice's provisions and warmed by the fire in her outer chamber. 12 other children who had been failing when the rescue began grew stronger on her preserved vegetables and smoked meat. By the time the temperature finally rose above 0 on the 23rd of February, 38 children under the age of 12 had passed through her dwelling, and all 38 were still alive. The contrast between her modest chambers and the ruins of the town below could not have been more stark. Greystone's schoolhouse lay collapsed and frozen, his 200 books from Boston reduced to illegible pulp beneath the snow. The Hendricks family's $1,100 frame house stood partially rebuilt, shored up with scavenged timber. But the room where Thomas had died remained untouched, a shrine to expensive failure. The granary that had seemed so adequate in autumn gaped empty, its contents consumed weeks before the winter released its grip. And on the cliff above it all, carved into the living stone, the dwelling that had cost $237 and 14 months of labor stood warm and whole and full of everything that mattered. The gathering came in April. It was Eleanor Greystone who proposed it, approaching Beatrice on a morning when the first green shoots were pushing through the melting snow. The winter had released them at last. 94 days of temperatures that had never risen above 0. And the survivors were beginning to emerge from their shelters like creatures waking from a long and terrible dream. "We should meet," Eleanor said, her voice carrying none of the brittle pride that had characterized it before the winter. "All of us who survived. We should meet and speak of what happened and what we learned and what must never happen again. Will you host us, Mrs. Beckett? In your chambers? It seems only right that we gather in the place that saved us." Beatrice considered the request for a long moment. Then she nodded. "The large chamber can hold perhaps 40, she said. "If people stand close and do not mind the warmth." "They will not mind," Eleanor said. "Not anymore." They came on the first Saturday of April, climbing the path that had become as familiar to them as the main street of Jasper Creek. 43 people crowded into Beatrice's outer chamber, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the strings of dried apples that had fed them through the darkest months. The jars on the shelves were depleted now, perhaps 50 remaining where 400 had once stood, but enough remained to remind everyone present of what had been sacrificed on their behalf. Beatrice stood at the back of her own dwelling, near the entrance to the middle chamber, and watched as the people of Jasper Creek arranged themselves in a rough semicircle. She saw Samuel Hadley, who had privately followed her advice and survived with his family intact. She saw the Hendricks family, missing Thomas but present and alive, Elizabeth clutching her mother's hand as if afraid to let go. She saw the Morales family, Diego and Maria, standing close together with the grief of their lost daughter still visible in the hollows of their faces. And she saw Zane Greystone, the schoolmaster, standing at the front of the gathering with his wife Eleanor at his side. He was the first to speak. "I must confess something," he began. and his voice, which had always carried such authority in town meetings and public gatherings, trembled at the edges. I must confess what I said, and what I believed, and what my certainty cost this community. He paused, gathering himself, and when he continued, his voice was steadier, but no less weighted with shame. I called Mrs. Beckett a cliff swallow building a mud nest. I stood in the schoolhouse that is now rubble and announced to everyone present that she had learned her architecture from the animal kingdom. I said that superstition was the refuge of the uneducated mind when she tried to warn us about the signs she had observed. I was so certain, so absolutely certain, that my books and my education made me wiser than a woman who listened to caterpillars and geese. His voice cracked and he stopped, pressing his hand against his eyes. Eleanor reached for him, but he shook his head and continued. The winter proved which of us was the fool. My schoolhouse collapsed. My library, 200 books that I had spent years acquiring, books that represented everything I believed about the power of education, they are gone, frozen into blocks of illegible pulp. And while I stood in the ruins of my life's work, Mrs. Beckett was feeding my students. While I wept for my books, she was teaching the children I had failed to prepare for the world as it actually is. She saved my family. She saved my students. She saved this community. And I mocked her. He looked directly at Beatrice then, his eyes wet with tears he made no effort to hide. I have no right to ask your forgiveness, Mrs. Beckett. I know this. I simply needed to say in front of everyone I misled with my certainty that I was wrong. I was deeply, profoundly, inexcusably wrong. And if you can find it within yourself to teach me what you know, I will spend the rest of my life being a better student than I was a teacher. He fell silent, and for a moment no one spoke. Then Eleanor Greystone stepped forward, her own face streaked with tears. I organized the Ladies' Auxiliary to exclude Mrs. Beckett from our gatherings, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the crowded chamber. I spread the name Swallow's Nest through our quilting circles and our harvest socials. I made certain that she was never invited to anything we considered polite society. I did this because my husband had dismissed her, and because she was different, and because her choices made me uncomfortable in ways I did not understand. She paused, swallowing hard. When my husband's schoolhouse collapsed and our children grew hungry, I was the one who climbed this path and begged for help, and Mrs. Beckett did not turn me away. She did not remind me of what I had done to her. She simply said to bring the children, and she fed them, and she taught me things that my grandmother should have taught my mother, and my mother should have taught me. I asked her if I deserved her kindness. She said no. She said the children deserved it, and she was right. If this confession is hitting differently than you expected, leave a comment. And stick around because what Beatrice says next will stay with you. Marcus Hendricks spoke next, his voice rough with the grief that had not left him since December. I built a house that cost $1,100, he said. I was proud of that house. I told everyone that it was the finest home in Jasper Creek, that no winter could touch us inside those walls. When Mrs. Beckett carved her chambers into the cliff face, I laughed with everyone else. I said she was wasting her money on a hole in the rock when she could have built something respectable. He stopped, his jaw working against emotions he was struggling to contain. My house collapsed on December 14th. The roof gave way under the snow and the walls followed, and my son Thomas was reading by the fire when the ceiling fell. He was 8 years old. He loved adventure stories. He had just finished one about men who explored caves in distant lands, and he was telling his sister about it when the world came down on him. His wife Sarah made a small sound of anguish, and Marcus reached for her hand without looking. Mrs. Beckett's walls are 3 feet of solid stone. Her roof is the cliff itself. Nothing could have fallen on her, because she built the way the mountain told her to build. She tried to tell us. She told Samuel Hadley about the signs. She warned us that the winter would be severe, and we called her superstitious and uneducated and laughed at her mud nest. He looked at Beatrice with eyes that held more pain than anger. I cannot ask you to forgive me for laughing when my son is dead because I did not listen, but I can tell you that I will never laugh at wisdom again, no matter where it comes from. And I will teach my daughter to listen to the mountains, the way you listen, the way we all should have listened. Maria Morales stepped forward then, leaning on her husband Diego for support. Her face was gaunt from grief and hunger and the long months of winter, and when she spoke her voice was barely above a whisper. "I did not mock you," she said. "I did not laugh at the meetings or call you names, but I did nothing to stop those who did. I was silent when I should have spoken, and silence is its own kind of cruelty." She pressed her hand against her chest, where her daughter Isabella had once rested. "My baby died on January 3rd. She was 4 months old. She was born in September, in the golden time when the harvest was coming in and everything seemed abundant. I did not think about winter because winter seemed so far away. I did not preserve food or prepare our home because I believed the granary would provide. And when the cold came and the food ran out, my daughter paid the price for my failure to listen." Her voice broke completely, and Diego wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her upright. "You fed us," Maria continued when she could speak again. "After Isabella was gone, after I had nothing left to lose, you fed us and taught us and never once said that we deserved our suffering. My husband and I will build a dwelling like yours into the hillside behind our property. We will fill it with preserved food, and we will name it for our daughter, so that she did not die for nothing." Samuel Hadley was the last of the confessors to speak. He stood with his hands folded before him, his graying beard neatly trimmed for the occasion, his eyes holding the quiet shame of a man who had tried to do right and failed. "I considered myself a decent man," he said slowly. "I prided myself on fairness, on treating all customers equally, on being the kind of merchant that a community could trust. When Mrs. Beckett came to my store and told me about the caterpillars and the geese, I listened. I nodded. I even believed her in some part of myself that I did not allow to guide my actions. And then I did nothing." He spread his hands, a gesture of helplessness. "I did not increase my stock. I did not urge others to prepare. I did not speak up when Zane Greystone mocked her at the town meeting. I told myself that it was not my place to interfere, that people would make their own choices, that I could not force preparation on those who did not want it. I told myself these things because they allowed me to avoid discomfort, to avoid conflict, to avoid being seen as the man who sided with the strange widow and her mud nest." His voice hardened with self-recrimination. "The granary ran out in mid-January. My stores were empty before February. People came to me desperate, and I had nothing to give them because I had failed to prepare when preparation was still possible. Mrs. Beckett's provisions fed this town for 2 months, while mine lasted barely 6 weeks. She listened to the mountains. I listened to my own cowardice." He looked at Beatrice with something like reverence in his tired eyes. "I have no right to ask forgiveness, but I can promise you that I will never again choose comfort over truth. And I will stock my store with canning supplies and teach every customer who walks through my door what you taught me about preservation. It is the least I can do for the woman who fed my neighbors when I could not." The chamber fell silent when Hadley finished speaking. 43 people stood in the warmth of the dwelling they had mocked, surrounded by the jars that had sustained them, waiting for the woman they had wronged to respond. Beatrice remained at the back of the chamber for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she stepped forward, moving through the crowd until she stood where the confessors had stood, her back to the shelves and her face to the community. My grandmother used to say that the mountains speak to those who listen, she began, her voice calm and measured. She said it every autumn when the signs began to appear, and she said it every spring when the predictions proved true. She survived winters that killed educated men, not because she was smarter than them, but because she was humble enough to learn from the world instead of trying to teach it. She paused, letting the words settle over the gathering. Grandmother Eliza died when I was 16 years old, and she gave me something more valuable than any library. She gave me the knowledge of 5 generations of mountain women who understood that preparation is not superstition, but respect. Respect for the winter that will come regardless of our wishes. Respect for the hunger that does not care about our plans. Respect for the mountains that have been here longer than our towns and will remain long after our towns are dust. Her eyes moved across the crowd, resting briefly on each of the confessors in turn. You have asked me to forgive you, but forgiveness is too small a word for what we survived together. You did not simply mock me. You mocked the knowledge that has kept my family alive for generations. You dismissed the wisdom of women who saved their children from starvation while their husbands' certainties crumbled. You called superstition what was actually observation, and you called education what was actually arrogance. Her voice remained steady, but something fierce burned beneath the calm. I will not say that I forgive you, because that would suggest that the wrong was done only to me. It was not. The wrong was done to Thomas Hendricks, who might have lived if his father had built differently. It was done to Isabella Morales, who might have grown to womanhood if her parents had been taught to prepare. It was done to old widow Patterson, who survived a wagon journey west and buried 4 of her 6 children only to freeze in her bed because no one checked on her when the coal ran out. This right here is the moment that changed everything for Jasper Creek. If you're still watching, you already know why this story matters. She let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until the confessors shifted on their feet and the observers held their breath. But I will not hold this winter against you forever. My grandmother would not have wanted that. She used to say that wisdom means nothing if it is not shared, that surviving alone is just a slower way of dying. She built her stores so that her neighbors could eat when their stores failed. She taught anyone who was willing to learn, even those who had mocked her before they understood. Beatrice's face softened, not into forgiveness but into something more practical. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. Not because you have earned it, but because the knowledge deserves to spread. Come to me in the summer months. Bring your children. I will show you how to read the signs and how to preserve the harvest, and how to build walls that no winter can penetrate. And perhaps, when the next killing winter comes, and it will come, we will face it as a community that listened instead of a community that laughed. She turned and walked back to her place near the middle chamber, and the gathering ended, and the people of Jasper Creek descended the path to their broken town with the weight of her words resting on their shoulders, like a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. 43 years later, when Beatrice Beckett died at the age of 67, 17 cliff dwellings dotted the valley around Jasper Creek. The first had been built by Diego and Maria Morales the summer after the killing winter, carved into the hillside behind their property and named Isabella's Rest. The second had been built by Marcus and Sarah Hendricks, a memorial to their son Thomas that they filled each autumn with preserved food they would never again take for granted. The third had been built by Zane Greystone himself. The schoolmaster had become Beatrice's most devoted student, arriving at her dwelling every Saturday morning for 5 years to learn the arts of preservation and observation. He had traded his certainty for humility, his arrogance for attention, and he had rebuilt his school not in the center of town, but into the hillside at its eastern edge, where 3 feet of solid stone protected the students and the new library from any winter that might come. He had taught his students what Beatrice had taught him, and they had taught their children, and the knowledge had spread through the community like water finding its level. The phrase swallow's nest had transformed in those decades from mockery to reverence. When someone in Jasper Creek built wisely, when they prepared for hardship before hardship arrived, the neighbors would nod and say they were building a swallow's nest. The term had entered the vocabulary of the region, spreading to the surrounding valleys and the settlements beyond, until people who had never heard of Beatrice Beckett used her name unknowingly every time they praised practical wisdom. Constance, the sorrel mare who had carried Beatrice west from Tennessee, died in the spring of 1902, 17 years after the killing winter. Beatrice had buried her on the slope below the cliff dwelling, in a spot where the morning sun fell warmly and the wild grasses grew thick in summer. She had marked the grave with a simple stone engraved with the horse's name and the words "faithful companion," and she had visited it every morning until her own death 15 years later. Beatrice passed quietly in her sleep on an October night when the first frost was painting the valley silver. She had spent her final day teaching Eleanor Greystone's granddaughter how to read the signs of the coming winter, pointing out the depth of the squirrels' burrows and the thickness of the caterpillars' coats. The girl was 12 years old, the same age Beatrice had been when she first began to learn from Grandmother Eliza, and she had listened with the focused attention that Beatrice remembered giving her own grandmother half a century before. The funeral was attended by every soul in Jasper Creek and many from the surrounding valleys. They stood on the slope below the cliff dwelling. Nearly 200 people gathered to honor a woman who had saved their parents and taught their children and transformed mockery into legacy. Zane Greystone, now 83 years old and stooped with age, delivered the eulogy with tears running freely down his weathered face. The dwelling still stands. The chambers that Beatrice carved with hammer and chisel more than 60 years ago remain solid and dry, protected by the same 3 feet of sandstone that sheltered her through the killing winter. The stove has been replaced twice and the timber front wall has been rebuilt once, but the stone walls bear the marks of her tools exactly as she left them. The shelves she built hold jars filled by her students and their students in turn, 400 glass vessels maintained in her memory, ready for any winter that might come. Above the entrance, carved into the living rock in letters that will endure for centuries, are the words Beatrice requested be placed there after her death. She had shown the mason the exact spot, had traced the letters with her finger, had specified the size and depth and spacing with the same methodical precision that had guided every aspect of her life. The inscription reads, "The mountains told me. I told you. Now we both know." Grandmother Eliza would have recognized those words. She had spoken them to Beatrice on a winter morning 60 years past, standing in her Tennessee cabin with the first heavy snow falling outside the window, her breath misting in the cold air as she packed salt around a ham and explained to her granddaughter that wisdom was not about knowing more than others, but about listening more carefully. The mountains had told Eliza, and Eliza had told Beatrice, and Beatrice had told Jasper Creek, and now the knowledge belonged to everyone who was willing to learn. The final line, carved smaller beneath the main inscription, was not part of Beatrice's instructions. It was added by Eleanor Greystone's granddaughter, the 12-year-old girl who had been Beatrice's last student, after she grew into a woman who built her own swallow's nest into the hillside and taught her own daughters to listen to the signs. It reads simply, "She listened. So did we. The mountains still speak to those who listen." And in Jasper Creek, Colorado, population 412 souls, there are always those who remember how to hear.